The Goths were a mighty, warlike people who originated in Scandinavia and migrated to mainland Europe, eventually reaching the hinterlands of the Roman Empire, to whom they were sometimes enemies and sometimes allies. Following the freezing over of the Rhine River in 406 AD, the Visigoths would cross and invade northern Italy before moving on Rome in 410, sacking the city under their first king, Alaric. They would thereafter settle in Aquitaine, briefly allying with the Romans to fight and defeat the Huns at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451. They would go on to fill much of the power vacuum left behind by the Romans, primarily in Iberia and Italy, where the Visigoths and later Ostrogoths would establish themselves. The Goths would reach their territorial zenith under Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, conqueror of Italy and a Roman emperor in all but name, who united the two Gothic crowns and brought general prosperity to his realm, especially in Italy, where he sponsored the restoration of many Roman cities. He ruled pragmatically, tolerating Chalcedonian Christians and their pope for most of his reign, though he and the Gothic nobility were Arian, non-Trinitarian Christians. This golden age would not last, however, as the Romans wished to reclaim what they considered their own. Belisarius would invade Italy in 535, less than a decade after Theodoric's death, and by the Battle of the Vesuvius in 553, any remnants of Gothic power in the peninsula would be erased, leaving only the Visigoths in Iberia. The Visigoths were eventually able to expel the Romans in time for the rise of Islam, by which point they had foregone Arianism and adopted the Roman Chalcedonian faith of the Spanish locals, which was and remains today the dominant form of Christianity, survived by Catholicism, which prevailed in Spain, Orthodoxy, and most forms of Protestantism. The years just prior to the Muslim invasion of Spain were tumultuous for the Visigoths, to say the least. Not much during this period can be stated as historical fact, and because of the significance that the conquest of Iberia holds both to the Orient and to the Occident, countless myths weave their way through a vast array of narratives, which we shall be taking a look at today. As in the title, this video will focus on King Roderic, a character surrounded in myth about whom we cannot say much in the way of fact, so take any specific details about his life with a grain of salt. Also note that many of the sources for this video are quite old, from a time when historiography wasn't so regulated, hence why this story cannot be told without giving mention to myth. I'll be discussing Roderic's usurpation of the Visigothic throne all the way to his fall at the Battle of Guadalete, which would open all Iberia to the Muslim armies under Musa ibn Nusayr and Tariq ibn Ziyad. In regards to legend, Roderic was important to Muslims, who often made him seem greater than he was as a way of sourcing legitimacy, and to Christians, who often degraded him as an excuse for their loss of Iberia. Almost all of the sources for these tales come from Europeans, and much of it is sourced from the tales of a fictitious priest named Agapida. And as it would turn out, the chronicles of Don Rodrigo, as he is known, would be immensely more popular in the Occident than in the Orient. Roderic is often lauded the title Last King of the Goths, and although this is not technically true, it does reflect his role in history and in legend, as shortly after his defeat any remaining pretender kings and lords would fall, without putting up much of a fight against Umayyad forces. I'd like to first touch on the small region of Ceuta, or Ceuta as it is called in Arabic. Ceuta was, for a long time, controlled by the Romans, even after they were expelled from Iberia proper. Although there are differing opinions, it seems that by the time the Umayyads had arrived in Mauritania, the Roman count in control of this area, named Julian in both Arab and Mozarab sources, had submitted to the Visigoths, whilst the Romans were losing out to the Arabs in the east. But upon threat of invasion, he switched allegiance once again to the side of the Umayyads, foregoing the Visigoths' new king Witiza, who was unable to protect Ceuta from the Muslim advance. The character of Julian will be important later. Witiza, sometimes given the epithet the Wicked, would be the last king to hold the entirety of Iberia in the name of the Goths, as the end of his reign would spark a succession crisis. The Mozarabic Chronicle, a Christian primary source for the Muslim conquest, states that Roderic, who was not from the legitimate line of succession, would overthrow Witiza in 710 AD, 1 year before the Islamic invasion, although the litany of myths often see him reign significantly longer before this. This would essentially split the kingdom along two lines, with part of it, including Toledo, being controlled by Roderic, and part of it mostly within modern-day Catalonia being controlled by Aquila II, who is often considered to have been the legitimate heir of Witiza. Many sources describe Witiza as rather licentious, with some labeling him a heretic for certain doctrinal changes he seemed to introduce into the Spanish Church, thus giving reasonable cause for his overthrow. American diplomat and historian Washington Irving wrote that, quote, "Witiza the Wicked had taught all Spain to sin," end quote. The historian John Bonner discusses the degradation of morality in the Gothic ruling class and the state of Spanish society upon Roderic's succession. Quote, "When the Goths first became masters of Spain, they were a rude tribe of savages without learning or culture. After they had mixed with the natives for a century or so, they became a refined and polished people, speaking Latin and trained in letters, law, and religion. And yet they still remained warlike and manly. But after they had been 2 or 3 centuries in possession of the rich valleys of Spain, they acquired idle and luxurious habits, spent their lives in drinking and feasting and dancing, and thus became as weak and helpless as the people of Rome that they had once conquered," end quote. A statement which, unfortunately, rings true for the Muslims as well, who would themselves fall into the same Sybaritism as the Goths centuries later. One of the reasons for the success of the Reconquista was because the Spaniards were left only with the harsh mountains of Asturias, leading in turn to a harsh life, which refined them into warriors, whereas the lush farmland of southern and central Spain intoxicated the Moors, who only grew more indolent as the years went on. Bonner continues, quote, "It was the old story. Powerful chiefs with men-at-arms under their command seized the richest lands and made the common people till then for their food and clothes. The man who drove the plow was cowed, houseless, hungry, ragged, unkempt, filthy, and ignorant. The man who owned the land lived in a splendid castle with soldiers guarding the gate. He wore clothes of silk and rich stuffs, ate choice food, drank fine wines, took his siesta in the shade of olive groves where fragrant flowers perfumed the air, listened to the sweet music of lutes, or lazily watched lovely girls dancing on Persian carpets for his delight. You know that there was too much contrast here for such a society to last. When the pillars of the arch are so very far apart, the cornerstone is apt to fall in," end quote. With all that said, there is no doubt why Roderic could find a willing support base for his coup. We are told that he was a young man well trained as a soldier and a commander, whose father had been wrongfully imprisoned by Witiza, that he routed the wicked king's armies in combat, imprisoned him, and was celebrated upon his coronation. King Roderic in these stories tends to exhibit a couple of different archetypes. He is often portrayed as described previously only during the beginning of his reign, before quickly becoming arrogant and power-hungry, oftentimes becoming a representation of the ever-amassing sin that Bonner describes. Other times, he is portrayed as a gallant and knightly ruler throughout, ruined only by his own overconfidence. In this video, I will be reading a paraphrase of but one European version of this story, given by Marian Florence Lansing in her book Barbarian and Noble, which I thought walked the line between the arrogant and knightly Roderic archetypes I brought up previously, followed by a discussion on some variations in the narratives and further historical context afterwards. Legend tells us that there was in the heart of Spain a palace, built within a cave in the olden days of magic and mystery, wherein was hid the fate of the Gothic kingdom in Spain, and that it was because Roderic penetrated its secrets that he was the last king of the Goths. An ancient prophecy had foretold, so the story ran, that barbarians would one day cross over from Africa and conquer the fair land of Spain. A wise king, adept in magic, sought to delay this fate by constructing a palace in a cave, placing within it a talisman to protect Spain from invasion. He knew that the prophecy would one day be fulfilled, but only hoped that his magic would delay this inevitable day. The entrance to this palace was guarded by a heavy iron gate, locked by the king. Over the centuries, each Spanish king would add his own lock until by Roderic's reign, 32 padlocks hung from the gate. Roderic, witnessing the decline of Gothic power and societal decay, decided against adding another lock. Instead, he sought to open the gate, dismissing the ancient warnings and claiming that they were attempts by a miserly king to hide his vast hoard of treasure. Ignoring his advisor's pleas, Roderic broke the seals and entered the palace, finding no treasure therein, but at its heart, in the final chamber, he found a marble urn with a scroll inside. It read as follows: "Unfortunate king, it is an evil hour in which thou hast come. Whenever this room is entered and this scroll read, the people shown in yonder picture shall invade the land and overturn the throne of its kings. The rule of the Goths shall end, and the land and the people shall be degraded by barbarian invaders." The picture opposite, mentioned in the scroll, revealed the invaders as the Arabs and Moors who sat at the border of the Visigothic kingdom waiting to strike. The king's realization came too late. He had unwittingly invited the invasion. That night, an earthquake would destroy the palace. As Roderic battled disturbances in the north, a traitor enabled the Saracens' invasion. Roderic returned south, but it was too late. He fought valiantly, but the Goths were overwhelmed, and Roderic vanished in the chaos, ending centuries of Gothic rule in Spain, and beginning an era of Saracen dominion. Those who tell this tale say that in a hermitage in Spain, there was found 200 years later a tomb with the simple inscription, "Here lies Roderic, last king of the Goths." This telling of the tale by Marion Lansing was but one version of this myth, and so there is much room for variation. Just to name a few examples, it is often said that the palace, claimed to have been built by a king of Spain in this version, was actually constructed by the Greek hero Heracles, and the magic cast by him as well. Sometimes, the palace built in a cave is actually a looming tower, with no cave given mention at all. The traitor who, quote, enabled the Saracens' invasion was the Roman Count Julian, whom I mentioned earlier. Historically, we can know, whether his name was Julian or not, that the Count of Ceuta submitted to the Umayyads eventually, providing them with ships to cross the Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Straits of Gibraltar. Stories of a possible motive for Julian's betrayal materialize in later European sources, some going as far as to say he himself initiated the raids into Visigothic territory on behalf of the Umayyads. It is said that his daughter Florinda had been a guest of Roderic's court, and that he had forced himself upon her, dishonoring her, her house, and himself in doing so. Those chroniclers who wish to portray Roderic as the zenith of sin in Spain often give this story. Thus, according to these accounts, it was Julian himself imploring the Umayyads to invade, as to get revenge upon Roderic. However, the Umayyads needed no such casus belli. In fact, their expansion into Iberia was almost inevitable, so it is easy to discount this as myth just the same. Historian Charles Morris tells us about some more fantastical variations in this story, supposedly from Arab sources, although this is around the time that Orientalists were forging translations of 1001 Nights stories, and in fact Morris and others mention these stories as a part of 1001 Nights, so keep that in mind. Although having read a fair share of its stories, I would be amiss to say it wouldn't fit the theme. I found it worth including these differences for the sake of interest. They seem to be taken from Washington Irving's book, Spanish Papers, who himself sources them from a book I could not find a reference to. Quote, "They speak of two ancient men with snowy beards who kept the keys of the gate and opened the locks only at Roderic's stern command. When the locks were removed, no one could stir the gates until the hand of the king touched them, whereupon they sprang open of themselves. Inside stood a huge bronze giant with a club of steel, with which he dealt resounding blows on the floor to the right and left. He desisted at the king's command, and the train entered unharmed. In the magic chamber they found a golden casket containing a linen cloth between tables of brass. On this were painted figures of Arabs in armor. As they gazed, these began to move, sounds of war were heard, and the vision of a battle between Arab and Christian warriors passed before the affrighted eyes of the intruders. The Christian army was defeated, and Roderic saw the image of himself in flight, and finally of his horse without a rider. As he rushed in terror from the fatal room, the bronze giant was no longer to be seen, and the ancient guardians of the gate lay dead upon their posts. In the end, the tower was burned by magic fire, and its very ashes were scattered by the wings of an innumerable flight of birds. It appears that many Arab versions of this tale are traced back to a commander under Tariq ibn Ziyad named Tarif bin Malik. Also note here the degradation of Roderic's character by the later Spaniards and the supposed exaggeration done by the Muslims. Additional to this story is that of Solomon's Table, a piece of treasure owned by the prophet king Sulayman, upon whom be peace, said to have been passed from the sack of Jerusalem to the Romans and from the sack of Rome to the Visigoths, eventually found within that cursed palace, a story which may have some truth to it. It is said that Tariq ibn Ziyad got his hands on this golden bejeweled table and used it to prove his own glory to the caliph in Damascus over that of Musa ibn Nusayr, who had tried to take credit for the conquest of Iberia himself. Hence why, today, throughout the Muslim world, it is indeed the name of Tariq which is widely remembered, and not that of Musa. And thus was the fall of the Visigoths. Although elaborating much on our primary source, the Mozarabic Chronicle, the myths do give us a picture of what might have happened. By the time of the last years of Wittiz's reign, the Umayyads had already arrived in the Maghreb and had led multiple raids into Iberia. However, they were never more than that, raids. It is likely that the army that had invaded Iberia under Tariq ibn Ziyad was initially itself a raiding party, and that only upon noticing the weakness of the Visigoths had begun to set its sights onto conquest, dealing the killing blow at Guadalete. Not much can be known about the Battle of Guadalete for certain, as with much of this tale. It is likely that the Umayyad forces were outnumbered by the Visigoths, but that the Visigoths, suffering from a possible drought and their lacking a feudal levy system, left them with a relatively disorganized, undisciplined army, composed mostly of conscript serfs and noble Goths who were not totally loyal to the usurper king Roderic. The Muslim biographer and historian Ahmed al-Maqri attributes the following speech to Tariq ibn Ziyad, the lead commander of the Muslims during the battle. Remember that I place myself in front of this glorious charge which I exhort you to make. At the moment when the two armies meet hand to hand, you will see me, never doubt it, seeking out this Roderic, tyrant of his people, challenging him to combat if God is willing. If I perish after this, I will have had at least the satisfaction of delivering you, and you will easily find among you an experienced hero, to whom you can confidently give the task of directing you. But should I fall before I reach to Roderic, redouble your ardor, force yourselves to the attack, and achieve the conquest of this country in depriving him of life. With him dead, his soldiers will no longer defy you. The clash lasted 3 days and ended when a rumor of King Roderic's death spread between both armies. Many of Roderic's troops deserted, and the Muslims were only invigorated by this false news. The army was routed, and unlike how it is told in myth, Roderic, it would seem, was killed in action. Back in Toledo, the throne had been usurped again, this time by Apis, who, like Aquila, was considered to be from Wittiz's line of succession, possibly even his brother. He is sometimes referred to as a bishop or archbishop. It is unknown how the Umayyads dealt with Apis or whether he submitted to their armies willingly, but what is known is that they saw little resistance past the Battle of Guadalete. Discontent amongst the native Iberian populace, and especially within its sizable Jewry, made the Muslim invasion quite welcome, especially considering their policies of religious tolerance. The pretender king Aquila II and his successor Ardo were handily dealt with by the marauding Umayyad forces, and the rule of the Goth in Europe would be ended for good. And as we all know, a golden age of culture and innovation would follow the Muslims into Spain, a romance which remains firmly in the heads of any Muslim who has spent any amount of time reflecting on his history. Great Muslim thinkers such as Ibn Rushd, the grandfather and grandson, Ibn Arabi, al-Zahrawi, al-Qurtubi, and countless others would emerge from what would be known as Al-Andalus. But so had God willed it that the Muslims would fall to the same vice as the Visigoths they had once so handily conquered. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم.